What if the cure was worse than the disease? What if someone was so determined to save humanity that they'd kill to do it? That's the chilling paradox of SCP-049, a being whose mission of mercy has left a trail of victims in its wake. Picture walking down a dim Foundation hallway and seeing a tall figure in a black robe and white bird-like mask. But wait, those aren't clothes. That's its actual body. Welcome to the chilling tale of SCP-049, also known as the Plague Doctor. Classified as Euclid by the SCP Foundation, this eerily polite entity stands nearly 2 meters tall and speaks perfect English and medieval French. But don't let its courteous manner fool you. One touch from SCP-049 means instant death. The Foundation keeps this polite but deadly doctor locked up in Site-19. And trust me, they take no chances. Every time they need to move it, they first knock it out with sedatives, strap it into a special harness, and have armed guards watching its every move. Why all the fuss? Well, one touch from SCP-049 is all it takes to kill you. But death isn't the end of this doctor's treatment. After killing its victims, it pulls out a mysterious black doctor's bag that seems bigger on the inside than outside. Then the real horror begins. Surgery time, using strange tools and dark fluids. It operates on the corpse until it comes back to life. But these aren't normal zombies. The doctor's cured patients, called SCP-0492, are violent and mindless, attacking anyone they see. What makes this SCP extra creepy is how well-mannered it is. It speaks perfect English and medieval French, and actually likes chatting with Foundation staff. It keeps calling itself a doctor and truly believes it's helping people by curing them of something it calls the pestilence. But here's the catch. Nobody knows what this pestilence actually is. When asked, SCP-049 gets weirdly vague, calling it an unspeakable horror that only it can see. Things got really dark when it killed Dr. Ham, a researcher who had been interviewing it for months. The Plague Doctor claimed it saw the pestilence in him and had to save him. When questioned later, it showed almost no remorse, saying, "The death of a colleague is always regrettable, but we must be swift in the face of the pestilence." The Foundation's tried everything to understand what makes this thing tick. They've given it animal corpses to work on, studied its strange surgical tools, and even tried to decode its journals, which turn out to be written in some unknown language. But the more they learn, the more questions they have. Is it really trying to cure some disease only it can see? Or is it just a killer with a doctor complex? The Foundation still doesn't know. But one thing's for sure. You definitely don't want this doctor making a house call. But that's just the beginning of this twisted tale. Ever wonder how a medieval plague doctor ended up as one of the Foundation's most dangerous entities? Grab your plague mask and surgical tools, because we're about to dive into the dark history of SCP-049, a story that will make your skin crawl. Do you know the sound of a dying town? It's not silence like the poets say. It's something worse whispers behind cracked doors. Hacking coughs that rip apart the quiet. The low groan of wooden carts hauling bodies to the pits. That's what Montauban sounded like in 1438. Death wasn't lurking in the shadows. It was out in the open, walking the streets, bold as you please. And in the middle of it all was him. No one knew his name. Not really. They called him the Doctor, though there wasn't much healing about him anymore. He wore those long black robes and a mask shaped like a bird's beak, just like all the other plague doctors. Only this one never left. He stayed long after the priests stopped blessing the dying and the gravediggers gave up on digging. There's a story about how he came to Montauban. It goes like this. When the Black Death swept through the land, it left nowhere untouched. Every man, woman, and child could feel its cold fingers creeping closer. The Doctor was no exception. He was just a healer back then, The kind who'd set your broken bones and rub lavender oil on your wounds. He had a family too, a wife and a little girl. Sweet thing. Always carrying a little doll she called Mireille. When the pestilence came, it took them first. You'd think losing them would have broken him. But no, it did something worse. It twisted him. You see, he didn't grieve like a normal man. He didn't cry or shout at the heavens. Instead, he started working, poring over his books, mixing powders and potions, muttering to himself late into the night. One day, he locked himself in his workshop and didn't come out for weeks. When he did, he wasn't the same. Those robes and that mask, they weren't just clothes. They were a second skin. No one dared ask what had happened. The first time people saw his work was on old Claude, the town beggar. Claude had been coughing up black bile for days. Everyone knew he wouldn't last the week. But then the doctor showed up, dragging Claude into an abandoned barn. No one went near. Not until the screaming stopped. When they finally cracked the door open, what they found wasn't Claude anymore. It was something else. It still looked like him mostly, but its eyes were wrong, dull, glassy, with this awful milky sheen. And the way it moved, jerky, like a puppet with its strings cut. Claude, or whatever it was now, didn't last long. He collapsed in the street, twitching like a dying animal, while the doctor just stood there, watching. "That wasn't healing!" someone shouted. The doctor didn't flinch. He just tilted his head, his bird-like mask catching the light. "It's a cure," he said, his voice muffled but calm. "A cure for the pestilence." That was just the beginning. The barn became his workshop. No one went near it unless they had no other choice. People started vanishing. First, it was the sick ones, the ones who were already half dead. Then it was the healthy ones too. A butcher's wife, a young apprentice, a child. Some of them came back, or at least parts of them did. People talked about hearing things at night. Wet, squelching noises, like something being dragged through the dirt. They said they saw figures moving near the barn, stumbling through the fields. One man swore he saw his dead brother clawing at his window, his mouth stretched into something that wasn't a smile. The council finally decided to act. They stormed the barn with torches and pitchforks, determined to put an end to whatever nightmare the doctor had unleashed. But when they opened the doors, he was already gone. The only thing left was his table, covered in tools that looked more like torture devices than surgical instruments. And in the middle of it all was a body, a little girl stitched up like a rag doll. Her chest had been opened and closed again, but her face was peaceful, almost as if she were sleeping. No one knew who she was, but there was something familiar about the doll clutched in her tiny hands. Mireille. They say he still walks the earth, that you can hear the soft rustle of his robes and the tapping of his staff on cobblestones in the dead of night. He's not looking for revenge. He's looking for something worse. They say he's still searching for the cure, and God help you if he thinks you have the pestilence. You ever wonder what it feels like to be truly obsessed? Not the kind of obsession where you stay up all night scrolling through the internet or thinking about someone who ghosted you. I'm talking about the kind of obsession that eats you alive, leaves nothing behind but the thing you're chasing. That was the doctor. After Montauban, he vanished like smoke. Some people claimed they saw him moving from town to town, slipping through the shadows, always one step ahead of the disease. But the truth is, no one really knows where he went. What we do know is that he didn't stop. Not for a second. They say he found a place deep in the forest, far from the prying eyes of the townsfolk. A crumbling abbey, long abandoned, where the walls whispered secrets to those mad enough to listen. That's where the real work began. The abbey became his kingdom. The stone walls lined with shelves that sagged under the weight of books and jars. No one knows where he got it all, the surgical tools, the endless supply of ink-black fluids, the preserved organs floating in brine. But he always had what he needed, as if the universe itself was bending to his will. And then there were the subjects. Some say he lured them in with promises of cures, others that he dragged them there in the dead of night. Either way, they didn't leave. The first few were failures, if you could even call them that. A farmer's boy, pale and trembling, strapped to a slab of cold stone. The doctor moved with mechanical precision, injecting the black fluid into his veins, cutting away parts of him that he deemed infected. When the boy's chest stopped rising and falling, the doctor didn't flinch. He simply scribbled notes into his leather journal, muttering to himself in a language no one could understand. Eventually, the failures started to move. The first time it happened, he was working on a merchant, an older man with calloused hands and a face weathered by the sun. The doctor had opened him up like a book, rearranging his insides with tools that glinted under the dim candlelight. He injected the man with something viscous, black as tar, and stitched him back together. Hours passed. The body lay still, then a twitch. The merchant's hand jerked once, then again, until his entire body convulsed violently. His eyes snapped open, unfocused and milky, and he let out a guttural moan that didn't sound human. The doctor leaned in close, studying his work with the intensity of a painter examining a masterpiece. "You're cured," he whispered. The thing on the slab didn't respond. It just flailed weakly, its limbs twisting at unnatural angles. Its mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, only a low, guttural groan that echoed through the abbey like a dying animal's cry. The doctor's journals called it a success. Word spread, as it always does. People whispered about the abbey in the woods, about the creatures that wandered its grounds at night. They called them revenants, but they weren't spirits. These were flesh and bone, twisted and wrong, with pale skin stretched too tight over their misshapen frames. The doctor didn't care. For every experiment, he learned something new. How to keep them moving longer. How to make their bodies accept the cure without rejecting it entirely. The failures were burned in great pyres that lit up the night sky, the smoke carrying the acrid stench of scorched flesh. But not all of them burned. One night, a group of villagers worked up the courage to go to the abbey. They were armed with torches, pitchforks, and a desperate need for answers. When they arrived, the heavy wooden doors were ajar, creaking on their rusted hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. The walls were lined with shelves of jars, their contents too horrifying to describe. On a table in the center of the room lay a body, or at least what was left of one. And then they heard it. A sound like wet meat hitting the floor, followed by a low, gurgling growl. Something moved in the shadows, shambling toward them. It stepped into the flickering light of their torches and they froze. It was human at least. It had been. Its arms were too long, its jaw unhinged and dangling as if it had forgotten how to close. Patches of its skin were sewn together with thick black thread, and its chest heaved with labored breaths. One of the villagers screamed, dropping his torch as the creature lunged forward. Chaos erupted. They scattered, some running for the door, others tripping over the debris that littered the floor. The last thing they saw before fleeing was the doctor, standing in the doorway, his beaked mask glinting in the firelight. He didn't chase them. He didn't say a word. He just watched, his head tilted slightly, as if amused by their fear. After that night, no one went near the abbey again. But the creatures kept coming, stumbling out of the woods, their guttural cries haunting the villagers in their sleep. And the doctor? He stayed in his abbey, his journals filling with page after page of incomprehensible notes. He was getting closer. He could feel it. The failures didn't matter, the screams didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the cure. You'd think someone like the doctor would be impossible to catch. Someone who worked in shadows, who could disappear into the night like smoke. But every nightmare ends eventually, and his came in Montauban years after his name had faded into legend, and his horrors became stories mothers told to keep their children from wandering too far at night. But the doctor hadn't stopped. He never stopped. The pestilence wouldn't allow it. The SCP Foundation found him by accident during an investigation into a string of disappearances. It started with livestock cows, goats, a few stray dogs, and escalated to farmers and their families. By the time the Foundation arrived, the town had already turned against itself. They blamed each other for the missing, the grief and fear boiling into something raw and violent. And while they burned homes and hung their neighbors, the doctor watched from the shadows, quietly collecting his next test subjects. The raid on his hideout came suddenly. Foundation agents stormed the decrepit house at the edge of town, weapons raised, the beams of their flashlights slicing through the gloom. What they found was worse than anything they'd imagined. The walls were lined with crude shelves, packed with jars of dark fluids and organs suspended in cloudy liquid. A table in the center of the room held the twisted remains of something vaguely human, its rib cage split open, its limbs stitched together with thick black thread. The smell was suffocating, a mix of rot and chemicals that clung to the back of their throats. And then there were the others. They stumbled from the shadows, their movements jerky and unnatural, their mouths twisted into slack, gaping expressions. Some were barely held together, their skin stitched over raw muscle, their eyes milky and unseeing. The Foundation agents opened fire. Bullets ripped through the creatures, but they didn't stop. Not at first. They lunged at the team, clawing and snapping like wild animals, until one by one they fell, their bodies twitching as the last of their unnatural life drained away. And through it all, the doctor stood in the corner, his mask tilted in quiet observation. When the last creature collapsed, he spoke for the first time. "Fascinating," he said, his voice calm, almost amused. "You've interrupted my work. I do hope you have a good reason." They subdued him without a fight. He didn't resist when they forced him into restraints, or when they locked him into the containment vehicle. He only asked one question, his tone polite but unyielding. "Will you be providing me with new subjects?" No one answered him. At Site 19, the containment cell was ready. Reinforced steel walls, a single observation window, and a constant rotation of armed guards. They weren't taking any chances. The doctor was classified as SCP-049, codename the Plague Doctor. His first few days in captivity were uneventful. He sat in the corner of his cell, scribbling in a leather journal with a quill that seemed to produce ink endlessly. The Foundation's linguists and codebreakers couldn't make sense of his writing. It wasn't any known language, and yet the doctor wrote with the confidence of a man penning a masterpiece. But his demeanor shifted when they brought him his first test subject. The subject was a D-class personnel, a man in his late 30s with a history of violent crime. He was shackled and trembling as they escorted him into the cell, his eyes darting between the guards and the doctor. The doctor stood slowly, his beaked mask turning to face the man. "Ah," he said softly, almost tenderly, "you're unwell." The D-class flinched as the doctor approached, his hands trembling against the restraints. "Please," he whispered, "I'm not sick." The doctor tilted his head. "You may not feel it, but the pestilence is there, festering beneath the surface. Do not fear. I will help you." What happened next was difficult to watch. The doctor moved with terrifying speed, his hand snapping out to touch the man's throat. The D-class collapsed instantly, his body going limp as if a switch had been flipped. The doctor wasted no time, pulling his black doctor's bag from seemingly nowhere. The guards watched in horrified silence as he opened the man's chest cavity with precise, almost surgical movements. "Fascinating," the doctor muttered, injecting the man's exposed organs with the viscous black fluid from his syringes. When the D-class finally stirred, his movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. His eyes rolled back, his mouth opening and closing in silent gasps. He lashed out suddenly, clawing at the walls of the containment cell, his strength far surpassing anything human. The guards were forced to intervene, neutralizing the reanimated corpse with a volley of gunfire. The doctor, now splattered with blood, simply stepped back, his mask tilting as if he were admiring his handiwork. "A success," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Over the next several weeks, the doctor became a subject of fascination and dread among the Foundation researchers. Interviews with him were unsettling, to say the least. He spoke politely, articulately, even charmingly, but there was an unshakable sense of menace beneath his words. "The pestilence is everywhere," he told Dr. Ham during one such interview. "Your kind may not see it, but I assure you, it festers in every corner of this world. My work is not a choice, it is a duty." The researchers couldn't agree on what to make of him. Was he a monster, a genius, or simply mad? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear. The doctor didn't see them as captors. He saw them as colleagues. And the containment cell? To him it was just another laboratory. The doctor was patient at first. In the beginning, his new containment was a curiosity, a puzzle to dissect. He spent days exploring every inch of his cell, running his fingers over the cold steel walls, tapping the edges of the observation window. His journal never left his side, pages filling with that incomprehensible script, the nib of his quill scratching in a rhythm that could drive you mad if you listened too long. The researchers thought they were in control. They watched him like hawks, jotting down every twitch, every tilt of his head, every muttered phrase. But they didn't see what he saw. To the doctor, they were blind men fumbling in the dark, too consumed by their fear to recognize the brilliance standing right in front of them. He tried to teach them. He answered their questions with more patience than they deserved, explaining his methods, his purpose, his unrelenting crusade against the pestilence. But they never truly listened. Not really. "You focus too much on the results," he said during one interview, his tone calm but edged with frustration. "What you see as failure, I see as progress. Every life I touch brings me closer to the cure." Dr. Ham, seated across the observation glass, didn't flinch. "Your progress kills people, Doctor. You're not saving anyone." The doctor tilted his head. "Death is but a temporary state, a minor inconvenience. Would you have me abandon my work because of a few casualties?" Ham didn't answer, but his silence said enough. The experiments continued, though they became more tightly controlled. The doctor was provided with corpses at first recently deceased animals, their bodies laid neatly on the steel slab in his cell. He accepted them with a polite nod, his hands steady as he prepared his instruments. The procedures were long, grueling affairs. He would spend hours hunched over the cadavers, his tools glinting under the fluorescent light. The researchers took meticulous notes, documenting every step of his work, but no one could explain what they were watching. The fluids he injected defied analysis, their composition shifting under every test. The organs he rearranged shouldn't have been able to function, yet somehow they did, at least for a time. And the results? They were grotesque. A goat reanimated with extra limbs, its spine twisted into a grotesque arc. A dog with a mouth that split its torso in two, its teeth snapping at the air. Each creation was an abomination, a mockery of life, and yet the doctor called them cures. "Rudimentary," he said once, as he prodded a shambling orangutan corpse that had collapsed after 2 days of reanimation. "But effective. The disease is eradicated. Their forms will improve in time." The researchers exchanged uneasy glances. It was hard to argue with a creature that could speak with such conviction while standing ankle-deep in blood and viscera. The turning point came when they brought him a human subject. He'd been asking for one since the day of his containment, though he always phrased it as a polite request. The Foundation denied him, of course, at least until the higher-ups decided they needed answers. They sent in D85123, a convicted murderer serving out his sentence as one of the Foundation's expendable assets. The guards didn't tell him much, only that he was being moved to a new assignment. When the cell door opened, the doctor stood perfectly still, his mask tilting slightly as he regarded the trembling man. "Ah," the doctor said, his voice warm, almost fatherly. "A patient." D-85123 tried to backpedal, but the guards blocked his path. "Don't let him touch me," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Please, I'm not sick." The doctor chuckled softly. "Fear not. The disease is insidious, yes, but I am quite capable of treating even the most advanced cases." The man screamed when the doctor raised his hand. What followed was a scene no one would forget. The doctor worked with a fervor that bordered on madness, slicing open the man's chest cavity with the precision of a seasoned surgeon. His black-gloved hands moved with impossible speed, rearranging organs, injecting fluids, and murmuring to himself in that alien language. When the man's body began to twitch, one of the researchers whispered, "Is he alive?" The answer was complicated. The subject opened his eyes, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He let out a low, guttural moan, his head lolling unnaturally to one side. The doctor stepped back, his hands clasped behind his back as he observed his creation. "There," he said, a note of pride in his voice. "The disease is gone. He is cured." The subject lunged without warning, clawing at the observation glass with inhuman strength. Alarms blared as the guards opened fire, the cell filling with the deafening crack of gunshots. When the creature finally collapsed, its blood pooling on the steel floor, the doctor sighed. "A minor setback," he said, retrieving his journal. "After that incident, the Foundation implemented stricter protocols. No more human test subjects. No more unsupervised experiments." The doctor didn't take it well. He became restless, pacing his cell for hours at a time. When the researchers refused to engage with him, he resorted to muttering to himself, his words growing sharper, more frantic. "You're wasting time," he snapped during one interview, slamming his journal against the glass. "Do you think your precious protocols will save you? The pestilence is spreading while you sit here playing at science." Dr. Ham kept his voice level. "We're done here." The doctor's mask tilted, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You're all infected, you know. Every last one of you. And when the pestilence takes you, don't say I didn't warn you." The containment staff began to notice strange things after that. The sound of scratching in the walls, the lights flickering without explanation. And sometimes, when you passed his cell late at night, you could swear you heard him laughing. Not the polite chuckle he used in interviews. This was something else, something far worse. It wasn't the first time someone died in Site 19, and it wouldn't be the last. But no one could have predicted how it would happen, or the aftermath that would haunt the staff for years. The day started like any other. SCP-049 sat quietly in his containment cell, his gloved fingers moving methodically across the pages of his journal. Outside, Dr. Raymond Ham prepared for yet another routine interview. He'd conducted dozens with the doctor, enough to almost feel comfortable in its presence. Almost. As the guards unlocked the cell door, Ham adjusted his lab coat and stepped inside, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, Doctor," Ham said, his tone carefully neutral. SCP-049 tilted his head, the dim light catching the curve of his beaked mask. "Ah, my dear colleague, you seem unwell." Ham frowned. "I'm fine, let's begin, shall we?" But SCP-049 didn't respond. It rose slowly from its seat, the leather of its robes creaking faintly as it moved closer. The guards tensed, hands on their weapons, but the doctor stopped just short of Ham, tilting his head as if studying him. "You've been exposed," it murmured. "Exposed to what?" Ham asked, his voice wavering. "The pestilence," SCP-049 said, almost reverently. "I can see it now, crawling beneath your skin." What happened next was chaos. SCP-049 lunged forward, its gloved hand darting out to grip Ham's wrist. The guards shouted, weapons drawn, but before they could react, Ham crumpled to the floor, lifeless. The doctor didn't stop. It retrieved its black bag from nowhere, its movements swift and deliberate. The guards opened fire, but the bullets didn't seem to matter. SCP-049 worked with unnerving calm, slicing open Ham's chest and injecting his organs with the writhing black fluid. By the time backup arrived, it was too late. Dr. Ham was standing again, his body jerking awkwardly as though a cruel puppeteer were pulling his strings. His head lolled to one side, and a wet, gurgling sound escaped his throat. "Magnificent," SCP-049 said, stepping back to admire its work. "He is cured." Containment protocols kicked in, and SCP-049 was subdued, its restraints reinforced, and its privileges revoked. Ham's body, now designated as SCP-049-2, was quickly incinerated, though not without cost. 2 more personnel were injured in the process, their wounds deep and jagged from Ham's violent resistance. The incident sent shockwaves through Site-19. Dr. Ham wasn't just a colleague, he was a friend, a mentor, a father to 2 young children. His death and what came after left a gaping wound in the Foundation's collective morale. And the doctor? It didn't seem to care. The interview that followed was tense. Dr. Theron Sherman sat across the observation glass, his face pale and drawn. SCP-049 sat on the other side, calm as ever, its hands clasped neatly in its lap. "I need you to explain yourself," Sherman said, his voice sharp. SCP-049 tilted its head. "Explain what, Doctor? My work speaks for itself." Sherman's hands tightened into fists. "You killed Raymond Ham. You butchered him like an animal." The doctor's mask turned slightly as if confused. "He was sick." "Sick?" Sherman snapped. "What the hell are you talking about? He was perfectly healthy." SCP-049 leaned forward, its voice dropping to a near whisper. "You don't understand. None of you do. The pestilence is an insidious foe. It hides itself well, but I see it. I can always see it." Sherman slammed a hand against the glass. "You're delusional. You didn't cure him. You turned him into a monster." The doctor recoiled slightly, as though stung by the words. "You may call it what you like, but I know the truth. He is free now, free of the disease that would have consumed him." Sherman's voice shook with rage. "You call that freedom? I call it mercy," SCP-049 replied, its tone cold and final. After the interview, SCP-049's privileges were permanently revoked. No more corpses, no more experiments, and no more interviews unless absolutely necessary. But the doctor didn't seem to mind. It returned to its journal, scribbling furiously, its quill scratching against the pages in a way that set everyone's nerves on edge. Sometimes it muttered to itself, its words barely audible through the observation glass. And sometimes it laughed softly, bitterly, as if at some private joke. The staff tried to move on, but the incident left scars. Rumors began to circulate, whispers of researchers waking up in the middle of the night, their throats burning, their skin itching as though something was crawling beneath it. And then there was the dream. Several staff members reported the same vision. A darkened operating room, the sound of wet flesh being sliced open, and the doctor standing over them, his mask tilted in mockery. "You're unwell," he would say, his voice low and soothing. "But don't worry, I'll take care of you." No one wanted to admit it, but the fear was spreading. Like a disease, like the pestilence, SCP-049 had been silent for weeks. The doctor's once constant muttering had faded to nothing, his journal closed and forgotten on the cold steel table. The containment staff weren't sure if this was a good thing or not. A quiet SCP usually meant stability, but with SCP-049, quiet felt like the calm before a storm. He just sat there, his beaked mask angled toward the floor, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The guards joked that he was sulking, but none of them dared to say it too loudly. There was something about the stillness that made the air feel heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. Dr. Elijah Itkin was the first to break the silence. He entered the observation chamber with careful, deliberate steps, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. SCP-049 didn't look up, but Itkin spoke anyway. "You've stopped writing," he said, his voice betraying his unease. Why? The doctor's head tilted slightly, the dim light casting shadows across his mask. I've reached an impasse, he murmured. Itkin frowned. An impasse? SCP-049 leaned back in his chair, his gloved fingers tapping against the table. You've restricted my work, limited my access to subjects. How am I to cure the pestilence if I cannot study it? Itkin's voice hardened. Your cures kill people. Death is preferable to the alternative, SCP-049 said, his tone icy. The pestilence is not a disease of the body, Doctor. It is a disease of the soul. You wouldn't understand. Then explain it to me, Itkin pressed. SCP-049's laughter filled the room, low and bitter, with no trace of humor. Ah, Doctor, you ask me to explain what your kind cannot comprehend. The pestilence is entropy, corruption, the slow decay of humanity. It seeps into the mind, the spirit, until there is nothing left but rot. He leaned forward, his mask inches from the glass. You're infected, you know, all of you. Itkin didn't flinch, though his hands trembled against the clipboard. That's enough for today, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. SCP-049 tilted his head. If you say so, Doctor. The Foundation's decision to restrict SCP-049's experiments had been a calculated move. They couldn't risk another incident like the one with Dr. Ham, but cutting him off had consequences they hadn't anticipated. SCP-049 was unraveling, his polite demeanor cracked, his frustration boiling to the surface in sharp, venomous outbursts. He berated the researchers during interviews, his voice rising to an almost animalistic snarl. You think you've stopped me? He shouted during one session, slamming his fist against the table. You've only delayed the inevitable. The pestilence will consume you, and when it does, you'll beg for my cure. The guards dragged him back to his cell, his laughter echoing down the corridors, and then came the dreams. It started with the researchers who worked closest to SCP-049. They reported vivid, unsettling nightmares of operating rooms drenched in blood, their bodies restrained on cold metal tables. In the dreams, SCP-049 hovered over them, his gloved hands slick with gore, whispering softly as he worked. You're unwell, he would say, but I'll fix you, don't worry. Some of the researchers began refusing assignments related to SCP-049, their nerves frayed and their eyes shadowed with exhaustion. A few were reassigned entirely after breaking down during interviews, their voices trembling as they described the feeling of something crawling beneath their skin. The Foundation dismissed the reports as stress-induced hallucinations. After all, SCP-049 had no anomalous influence beyond his touch. At least that's what they told themselves. But SCP-049's own mind wasn't immune to the weight of his failures. Inside his cell, he spent hours staring at the walls, his hands twitching with the need to create. He didn't want to admit it to himself or to anyone else, but doubt had begun to creep into his thoughts. What if the pestilence wasn't what he thought it was? What if his cure wasn't a cure at all? The memories came unbidden, clawing at the edges of his mind. A little girl, her chest stitched together with trembling hands. A young boy's lifeless eyes staring up at him as he whispered promises of salvation. The smell of burning flesh as his cured subjects were incinerated, their twisted bodies reduced to ash. He could still see their faces, hear their screams. No, he muttered, shaking his head violently. They were infected. I saved them. I saved them. The darkness didn't answer. The researchers noticed the shift, though they didn't understand it. SCP-049 became quieter, more withdrawn. His outbursts ceased, replaced by a heavy oppressive silence. Some thought he was giving up. Others weren't so sure. One night, a guard reported hearing something unusual, a sound like scratching, faint but persistent, coming from SCP-049's cell. When they checked the observation cameras, they saw him sitting at the table, his hands folded neatly in his lap, But the scratching didn't stop. It echoed through the empty corridors, growing louder, closer, until it felt like it was coming from the walls themselves. When the guard returned to his post, he found a note scrawled on the back of his clipboard. "You're unwell, I can help." No one admitted it, but the staff had begun to dread SCP-049. Not for what he had done, but for what he might do. The silence wasn't a surrender. It was a storm waiting to break. And when it did, they knew it would be unlike anything they'd seen before. It started with an anomaly. The security cameras in SCP-049's containment cell went dark for exactly 23 seconds. When the feed resumed, everything appeared normal. The doctor sat in his usual place, his journal open before him, his hands folded neatly. But something had changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the air, a tension that coiled around Site-19 like a living thing. The staff couldn't explain it, but they felt it. Dr. Elijah Itkin was the first to notice the strange behavior. SCP-049 had stopped responding during interviews. He didn't argue, didn't lash out, didn't even scribble in his journal. He just sat there, his mask tilted ever so slightly, as if he were watching something only he could see. And then the scratching began again. That night the alarm sounded. The containment breach wasn't unexpected. Site-19 had seen its share of chaos, and the protocols were drilled into every staff member's mind. But this wasn't a typical breach. It wasn't one anomaly. It was all of them. SCP-049 was loose. The guards found the first body in the observation wing. A researcher, her throat torn open, her face frozen in a mask of terror. The second was in the stairwell, his limbs twisted at impossible angles, his eyes wide and unseeing. The doctor moved through the facility like a shadow, silent and unyielding. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was searching, and he wasn't alone. The creatures, his creations, staggered through the halls, their guttural cries echoing through the steel corridors. The security footage showed glimpses of them, pale, misshapen things with limbs stitched together, their movements jerky and unnatural. But it wasn't chaos. It was a pilgrimage. Dr. Itkin was in the safe room when SCP-049 found him. The reinforced door buckled with a groan, and the doctor stepped inside, his black robe sweeping the floor. Behind him, two of his patients waited, their blank eyes staring straight ahead. "Dr. Itkin," SCP-049 said, his voice calm, almost kind. "You've been avoiding me." Itkin backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. "Stay back." SCP-049 tilted his head, the dim light casting long shadows across his mask. "You misunderstand me. I am not here to harm you. I am here to help." "Help!" Itkin spat, his voice trembling. "You call this help? You're a monster!" The doctor's posture stiffened, but his voice remained steady. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I enjoy watching you suffer? Watching the pestilence devour everything it touches?" His hand raised, gesturing to the creatures behind him. "They are not perfect, no, but they are pure, free of disease, free of decay. I have given them something your kind could never offer, salvation." Itkin's voice cracked. "You're delusional." SCP-049 stepped closer, his shadow looming over the trembling researcher. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but can you say with absolute certainty that you are not infected?" Itkin didn't answer. He couldn't. The breach ended as suddenly as it began. The Foundation's response team swept through Site-19, neutralizing the anomalies one by one. The creatures were destroyed, their bodies burned, and the surviving staff evacuated. They found SCP-049 in the lower levels, kneeling among the wreckage. His mask was cracked, a thin line running down its beak, and his robes were torn and bloodied. He didn't resist. When the guards approached, he raised his hands, his voice quiet but firm. "The work must continue," he said. "You cannot stop the inevitable." They dragged him back to his containment cell, his silence heavier than the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hall. The aftermath was a blur. The Foundation repaired the damage, replaced the staff, and reinforced the containment protocols. But something lingered. The staff whispered about SCP-049's final words during his post-incident interview. "I saw it," he said, his voice low and fractured. "The pestilence. It's in all of you." Dr. Theron Sherman leaned forward, his tone sharp. "What do you mean by that?" SCP-049 tilted his head, his mask catching the light. "Entropy. Decay. Your very existence is infected. You call it life, but I know what it truly is." He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I am not your enemy, Doctor. I am your only hope." Sherman didn't respond. He didn't have to. Even now, long after the breach, the staff at Site-19 claim they can still hear the scratching, faint but persistent, like a warning, like a promise. But before we wrap up, let's dive into some fascinating theories about what the Plague Doctor's mysterious pestilence might actually be. Ready to have your mind blown? The most chilling theory comes from SCP-5000's timeline, where the Foundation discovered something horrifying. A malicious entity living inside humanity's collective consciousness, responsible for all human pain and suffering. Some believe this might be the very pestilence our medieval doctor has been fighting all along. Think about it. What if SCP-049 can somehow sense this hidden entity that's infected all of humanity? Another mind-bending detail. When the Foundation used a special camera, SCP-978, to photograph the Plague Doctor, it showed him embracing a young child, possibly his daughter, while his zombified patients wandered in the background. This tender scene hints at a deeper tragedy we may never fully understand. Here's something wild. In one alternate universe, SCP-049 created so many of his cured monsters that they took over the entire world. That's right. One version of our polite doctor accidentally triggered an apocalypse trying to save everyone. Let's break down what makes this SCP truly fascinating. Despite being deadly, it's incredibly well-mannered and genuinely believes it's helping people. Its doctor's bag is bigger on the inside. Yes, like a medieval TARDIS. Those robes and mask, they're not clothes but actual parts of its body, made of muscle and bone. It writes in a language so strange that even the Foundation's best codebreakers can't figure it out. But perhaps the most interesting aspect is how SCP-049 interacts with other SCPs. When it met the shy and deadly SCP-096 instead of fear, it showed compassion, treating the creature like an injured child. Even when face-to-face with the nearly indestructible SCP-682, it tried to cure the creature, though that didn't end well for our doctor friend. Here's the kicker. In one test, someone used special glasses that could see the value of anything they looked at. Want to know what 049 was worth? About 634 billion plague-infected rats. Make of that what you will. Here's a dark thought. What if the pestilence isn't a disease at all, but life itself? What if SCP-049 sees existence as an ailment that needs to be cured through death and reanimation? Its victims do become essentially immortal, after all, just not in a way most of us would want. In the end, SCP-049 remains one of the Foundation's most enigmatic entities. Is it a misguided healer, a delusional killer, or perhaps something far more complex, a being that sees a horror in humanity that we're mercifully blind to? And that's the SCP-049, the doctor whose cure might be worse than any disease. If you enjoyed diving into the twisted world of the Foundation's most polite killer, please hit that like button. It helps more people find these SCP stories. Got an SCP you want to hear about next? Or maybe you have your own theory about what the pestilence really is? Drop it in the comments below. And if you're new here and want more deep dives into the strangest and scariest SCPs, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next. This is MM13. reminding you that sometimes the scariest monsters are the zoo.